Before we continue celebrating this magnificent property, I have a personal announcement. The champagne glass trembled in Margaret's hand. She watched her husband raise his own glass toward the crystal chandeliers, toward the 200 faces turned in his direction, toward the future he was about to claim without her in it. My wife has been many things to me during our marriage. Patient, accommodating, simple in her tastes and her expectations. The word simple landed in the center of the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret felt the ripple pass through the crowd. She saw the sideways glances, the polite discomfort, the fascination that comes from watching someone else's destruction. But as Harbor Point expands, as we prepare to become the premier destination on the eastern seaboard, I have come to realize that some partnerships have natural endpoints. A woman in emerald silk rose from a nearby table. Blonde hair perfectly arranged. Diamonds catching the chandelier light. The smile of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Diana Weston has agreed to stand with me as we enter this new chapter. Margaret's vision narrowed to the leather folder Victor pulled from his jacket. She knew what it contained before he spoke again. She had known, somewhere deep in her chest, for months. Perhaps for years. The divorce papers are already prepared. I am asking Margaret to sign them tonight, here, in front of everyone who matters to our future. 200 people watched. 200 people who could have objected. Not one of them moved. Victor walked toward her with measured steps, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He placed the folder directly in front of her, beside the champagne she had not sipped and the dinner she had not touched. Sign them and I will make sure you are comfortable. Enough to go back to whatever quiet life you had before I found you. Margaret looked at the papers. At the man she had loved for 7 years. At the woman already claiming her place. At 200 witnesses who had chosen spectacle over decency. She picked up his pen. And signed without reading a single word. Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you are new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. The ballroom doors closed behind Margaret with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The night air touched her face. Cool. Salt-tinged from the harbor. Real in a way nothing inside that room had been real. She walked without knowing where she was going. Her heels clicked against the stone pathway that wound through the resort grounds. Past the perfectly manicured gardens. Past the fountains that had cost more than most families earned in a decade. Past the waterfront where boats rocked gently in the darkness. She stopped at the edge of the harbor. The water was black and calm. Somewhere in the distance, a lighthouse beam swept across the darkness, appearing and disappearing in a rhythm that felt like breathing. Margaret reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in her hand. She stared at it for a long moment, her finger hovering over a contact she had not dialed in 7 years. She pressed the call button. 3 rings. Then a voice she had almost forgotten. A voice that sounded exactly the same as it had the day she left. Margaret. Just her name. No surprise. No anger. No questions about why she was calling at 11 at night after 7 years of silence. Just her name, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting. Mother. The word broke something open in her chest. She felt tears finally coming, the tears she had refused to shed in front of Victor and Diana and 200 witnesses. Where are you? Margaret gave the address. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Do not move. We are coming. That was all. No demands for explanation. No recriminations about the years of distance. Just the promise Margaret had been given 7 years ago, the promise she had never believed she would need to claim. We are coming. Margaret sat down on a bench overlooking the water. She watched the boats rock in the harbor. She watched the lighthouse beam sweep its patient arc. She waited for the family she had walked away from. And finally, alone in the darkness, she allowed herself to cry. To understand the weight of what happened that night, we need to go back to the beginning. To the moment Margaret Holloway decided to disappear. The Holloway family compound occupied 3 miles of Maine coastline. Private harbors sheltered behind natural rock formations. Restored lighthouses that had guided ships for 200 years. A main house that had welcomed presidents, foreign dignitaries, and captains of industry for longer than anyone could precisely remember. If American maritime history had a beating heart, it pumped Holloway blood. The fortune had been built across 6 generations, beginning with whaling ships in the 1840s. Margaret's great-great-grandfather had recognized the future in steam when sailing vessels still dominated the seas. Her great-grandfather had invested in steel hulls when wooden ships seemed permanent. Her grandfather had seen containerization coming and positioned the family to own the ports themselves, not just the vessels passing through them. By the time Margaret was born, Holloway Maritime controlled shipping routes that touched 4 continents. The family did not just move goods across oceans. They owned the infrastructure that made movement possible. The docks, the cranes, the warehouses, the rights to waterfront that developers would mortgage their futures to access. Eleanor Holloway had run the empire since her husband's death 15 years earlier. Silver-haired at 63, sharp-tongued in 6 languages, capable of dismantling a corporate rival before lunch and hosting a state dinner by evening. She had raised 2 children to understand that the Holloway name carried responsibilities extending far beyond personal happiness. Margaret's brother William had embraced those responsibilities eagerly. At 34, he managed the international divisions with the calculated precision their mother had taught him. He lived for the negotiation, the acquisition, the expansion of territory that had been expanding for generations. Margaret had never found that same hunger. She painted watercolors of the coastline, spent hours in the family archives preserving documents that traced their history back to handwritten manifests from ships long since rotted. She taught reading to the children of dock workers during summers and cried at films about animals separated from their families. Her sensitivity was genuine. Her discomfort with the sharp edges of empire was real. And by 25, she felt like she was slowly suffocating beneath expectations she had never chosen. The charity gala was held at the estate on a June evening. 200 guests filled the gardens and the ballroom. Politicians whose campaigns the family quietly funded. Business leaders whose companies depended on Holloway infrastructure. Entertainment executives. Old money families whose children had been circling Margaret like sharks since she turned 18. She stood on the terrace overlooking the ocean, watching the party through the French doors. The same faces she had seen at every event for 25 years. The same conversations about mergers and acquisitions and who was buying what and which senator could be influenced. A young man approached with champagne and a smile that had clearly been practiced in front of mirrors. Prescott Worthington III, from a banking family that went back 6 generations. "Margaret, you look absolutely stunning tonight." His eyes did the calculation she had witnessed 1,000 times. He was not seeing her. He was seeing the Holloway empire attached to her name. "Thank you, Prescott. I was hoping we could talk about Newport this summer. Mother is hosting at the compound and she specifically asked me to extend an invitation to you personally." "That is very kind, but I have other commitments." "Other commitments?" He laughed as if the concept was absurd coming from her. What could possibly be more important than the Worthington summer season? Margaret looked at this man with his perfect hair and his perfect pedigree and his perfect inability to see her as anything other than a merger opportunity. Something inside her cracked. "Excuse me." She walked away without looking back, leaving Prescott standing on the terrace with his practiced smile faltering. Inside the main house, Margaret found her mother in the library. Eleanor stood by the window with a glass of red wine, watching the party with an expression of detached observation. "Running away, darling. Suffocating." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if this was a conversation she had been expecting for years. "I remember that feeling." Margaret moved to stand beside her mother, both of them looking out at the party neither wanted to attend. "When did it stop?" "When I found purpose beyond the performance." Eleanor turned to look at her daughter with those sharp, knowing eyes. "But you are not looking for purpose, are you? You are looking to discover if anyone could love you for yourself." The words hit Margaret like a physical impact. "Yes. That is exactly it." "Then perhaps you should go find out." Margaret stared at her mother. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you have spent your entire life in a cage made of gold and silk and expectations. Perhaps it is time to see what you can build without it." "You are telling me to leave." "I am telling you that you have my permission to discover who Margaret is when no one knows her last name." Eleanor's voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "Take 5 years. Change your name. Live anonymously. Find out if real love exists outside these walls. But the family, the business, the expectations. Your brother can manage the empire. He was born for it. Eleanor reached out and took her daughter's hand. You were born for something different. I have always known that. I think you have too. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. And you would just let me go. I built this empire so my children could have choices, not chains. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand. If you ever need me, if you are ever in trouble, if you ever want to come home, I will move heaven and earth to reach you. But until then you will have the freedom to fail, to struggle, to grow, to love without the weight of 6 generations on your shoulders. What about William? Your brother will argue. He will say you are being reckless and naive and throwing away your future. Eleanor smiled slightly. And I will handle him. That is what I do. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her bedroom at the compound, looking at 3 suitcases that contained everything she was allowed to bring from her old life. Clothes that did not look expensive. Art supplies. Journals. Photographs she could not bear to leave behind. William appeared in her doorway. His jaw was tight. His eyes were troubled. I still think this is a mistake. I know you do. He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking at the suitcases like they were enemy combatants. You have everything here. Everything anyone could want. Why would you give that up to live like someone ordinary? Because I need to know if someone could love ordinary. Margaret turned to face her brother. I need to know if I am worth anything beyond this name. You are worth everything. Then let me prove it to myself. William was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and pulled her into a hug that was fiercer than any embrace they had shared since childhood. If anyone hurts you, I will end them. Margaret laughed despite her tears. I know you will. I mean it. He pulled back to look at her face. I will find them and I will destroy everything they have ever built. That is not a threat. That is a promise. She touched his cheek gently. I love you too. That evening, Margaret said goodbye to the lighthouse on the point. She stood at the base of the tower her great-great-grandfather had built, watching the beams sweep across the darkening water. For 200 years, that light had guided ships home. For 25 years, it had been the last thing she saw before sleep and the first thing she looked for every morning. She did not know when she would see it again. Margaret Brennan. That was the name on her new documents. Margaret Brennan, with a modest background and an art education degree and absolutely no family connections. She boarded a train heading south, carrying 3 suitcases and a name that felt like a costume she had not yet learned to wear. The apartment was a 1-bedroom above a bookshop in a coastal village 300 miles from home. Close enough to the ocean that she could smell salt when the wind blew right. Far enough from Maine that no one would recognize her face. The apartment was drafty. The plumbing complained at unpredictable hours. The view consisted of a parking lot and the back entrance of a seafood restaurant. Margaret had never been happier. Her landlady was an elderly widow named Ruth who owned the bookshop below. Ruth made tea too strong and gave unsolicited advice about everything from posture to romantic prospects. You look like someone running from something. Margaret accepted the tea Ruth pressed into her hands. Maybe I am running toward something. Ruth studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled easily. Same thing sometimes. Just depends on which direction you are facing. The first weeks were brutal in ways Margaret had not anticipated. She learned that grocery shopping required planning and budgeting and comparing prices. She learned that laundry could not simply be left for someone else to handle. She learned that the sounds of ordinary life, neighbors arguing in cars starting at 5 in the morning and the restaurant dumpster being emptied at midnight, were very different from the quiet of a 300-acre estate. She ate toast for 3 days straight because she did not know how to cook anything else and could not afford to eat out. She burned her first attempt at pasta so badly the pot had to be thrown away. She cried once, at 2 in the morning, sitting on the fire escape, wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake. But she did not call her mother. She did not ask to come home. She had asked for this freedom, and freedom, she was learning, came with a cost. The cost was discomfort. The cost was uncertainty. The cost was facing every day without a safety net or staff or a name that opened doors. She decided the cost was worth it. The job posting was simple. Archivist assistant needed for local historical society. Preserve documents and assist researchers. Modest salary. Meaningful work. Margaret applied with her new name and her carefully constructed background. The interview was conducted by a woman named Dorothy Crane, 68 years old, who had run the Historical Society for 30 years on a budget that should have been impossible. Mrs. Crane's office was small and cluttered with papers and photographs and artifacts that needed cataloguing. She studied Margaret over reading glasses that perched on the end of her nose. Why do you want this job? Because history matters. Margaret's answer surprised her with its honesty. Because preserving what came before us matters. Because someone should remember the people who built the harbors and sailed the ships and made this town what it is. Mrs. Crane was silent for a long moment. You have gentle hands. Excuse me. Documents require gentle hands. People who rush, who grab, who do not understand that they are touching something irreplaceable. They destroy more than they preserve. Mrs. Crane leaned back in her chair. You have gentle hands. That is more important than any degree you might have earned. Does that mean I am hired? That means you start Monday. Do not be late. The documents do not care about your excuses. The Historical Society occupied a converted house on the edge of downtown. 2 stories of maritime records, photographs, personal letters, shipping manifests, and artifacts that trace the town's history back to its founding in 1792. Margaret learned the work quickly, cataloguing documents that had survived 2 centuries of salt air and neglect, photographing fragile papers before they deteriorated further, helping elderly visitors trace their ancestors through ship passenger lists and census records. The work was quiet and meaningful, and nobody looked at her and saw dollar signs or merger opportunities. Nobody calculated whether her bloodline would strengthen their position. Nobody asked about her family or her connections or her plans for the empire she was expected to inherit. She was simply Margaret Brennan, a woman who worked at the Historical Society, a woman who was good at her job. That was enough. In her tiny apartment, Margaret painted for the first time without an audience. Watercolors of the coastline that reminded her of home but was not home. The harbor at different hours. The boats that came and went. The particular quality of light on water in the early morning. No one was evaluating her work. No one was calculating its market value. No one was watching to see if she would live up to the family legacy of artistic taste. She painted what she wanted to paint. And the paintings were more honest than anything she had created before. Ruth displayed one in the bookshop window without asking permission. A watercolor of the harbor at sunset, all gold and blue, and the silhouettes of boats against the fading light. A customer offered to buy it. Margaret refused. Not because of the price, but because it was the first thing she had made that was entirely hers. The loneliness was harder than she had expected. There were nights when Margaret sat in her apartment and missed her mother's wisdom. Her brother's terrible jokes. Even the weight of expectations that had once felt suffocating. At least that weight had been familiar. She wrote letters to her mother that she did not send. Long rambling accounts of her days, her work, the documents she was preserving, the paintings she was creating. She sealed them in envelopes and tucked them in a drawer, proof that her old life still existed even if she could not return to it. Ruth noticed the loneliness even when Margaret tried to hide it. You are too young to live like a hermit. I am not a hermit. I go to work. I shop for groceries. I walk on the beach. You do everything alone. Margaret shrugged. I am learning to be comfortable with myself. That is admirable. Ruth poured more of her too-strong tea. But humans are not meant to be islands. Eventually the solitude stops being peaceful and starts being prison. Margaret did not argue. She knew Ruth was right. But she was not ready yet. She was still learning who she was when no one was watching. She could not risk letting someone in until she understood what they would be finding. 3 years passed in a rhythm of work and painting and slow contentment. Margaret Brennan became a real person instead of a costume. The name fit. The life fit. She had friends now, colleagues at the Historical Society and regulars at the bookshop who recognized her face and asked about her day. She had routines that belonged to her alone. She had created something small and genuine and entirely her own. Her old life felt like it had happened to someone else. Which is perhaps why she was not prepared when Victor Aldrich walked into the Historical Society on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was tall, dark-haired, going silver at the temples. Features that photographers would describe as classically handsome. Dressed in clothes that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent but worn with the casual ease of someone who had stopped noticing price tags. He scanned the room with obvious assessment, his eyes calculating the value of everything they touched. Including her. "I am looking for coastal survey maps." His voice was direct, businesslike, with an undertone of impatience. "Property boundaries along the northern coastline. Anything you have from the original land grants through the present day. For development purposes." He raised an eyebrow at her question. "Does that matter?" "It matters to the maps." Something shifted in his expression. Interest, perhaps, or amusement at someone who did not immediately defer to his obvious wealth. "Yes. For development purposes. I am building a resort and I need to understand the historical property lines." Margaret studied him for a moment. Developers usually meant destruction. They looked at coastlines and saw profit margins, not the 2 centuries of history that had shaped every harbor and hillside. But something in his directness appealed to her. He was not pretending to be anything other than what he was. "The survey maps are in the back room. I can show you what we have." She led him through the stacks to the map collection. For the next hour, she pulled documents and explained their context and answered his questions about property boundaries and coastal access rights. He listened with genuine attention. He asked intelligent follow-up questions. He treated her expertise as something valuable. "You know a great deal about this." "It is my job to know." "It is more than that." He set down the map he had been examining. "You care about these documents. You understand what they represent. They represent people. Families who built their lives here. Industries that shaped the economy. Decisions that determined what this coastline would become. Most people see old paper. Most people are not paying attention." He smiled then, and the expression transformed his face. Made him look younger. Made him look almost warm. "I am Victor Aldrich. Margaret Brennan." "Well, Margaret Brennan. Would you have dinner with me?" Every instinct told her to say no. Romance meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant potential exposure. She had spent 3 years carefully avoiding entanglements that might complicate her anonymous life. But there was something about the way he looked at her. Like he was seeing her specifically. Not a family name. Not a net worth. Just a woman who knew about coastal survey maps and cared about old documents. "One dinner." He smiled wider. "One dinner. I promise not to be boring." Margaret chose a small restaurant that Ruth had recommended. Nothing impressive. Just good food and reasonable prices and the kind of atmosphere that could not be manufactured. Victor arrived in jeans instead of the expensive suit he had worn at the Historical Society. He was adapting to her, she realized. Performing casual. She was not sure whether to be flattered or concerned. "So, Margaret Brennan, tell me about yourself." "There is not much to tell. I work at the Historical Society. I paint in my spare time. I live in a small apartment with plumbing that has opinions." Victor laughed. "A starving artist in a coastal town. How perfectly cliché. Says the man in jeans that probably cost more than my rent." He laughed again, and the sound was genuine. "Tuche. Fair point. All right. I run a resort development company. Very corporate. Very boring. Nothing like what you do." "What do I do?" "You preserve things." He leaned forward slightly. "You protect things that matter from being forgotten. That is not boring at all. And building resorts is. Building resorts is necessary. People need places to escape. But it is not." He paused, searching for the word. "It is not meaningful in the way your work is meaningful." Margaret studied him across the table. This was not the conversation she had expected. Developers usually talked about money and growth and the exciting future they were creating. They did not admit that their work lacked meaning. "Why do you do it then? If it is not meaningful?" "Because I have something to prove." His voice shifted. Became harder. "My father told me I would never amount to anything. Said I did not have the breeding for real success." Breeding. Old money talk. Victor's jaw tightened. He came from nothing and married into nothing and spent his whole life pretending he belonged to something. When I decided to build my own company, he told me I was a fool. Said people like us do not get to create empires. We just serve the people who already have them. Margaret's chest tightened with irony. Here was a man who thought they came from similar circumstances, who believed they were both self-made, both without privilege. She should tell him. Right now, before this went any further. But the words stuck in her throat. What did you do? I proved him wrong. Victor's eyes met hers with intensity that made her breath catch. Everything I have, I built from my own hands. My own work. My own refusal to quit when everyone said I would fail. That must have been difficult. It was. But it made me who I am. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. That is why I noticed you immediately. In the historical society. You were not performing for anyone. You were just focused on your work. Just being genuine. Do you know how rare that is? Margaret felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. He seemed so sincere. So different from the Prescott Worthingtons of her old world who only saw her last name. I do not know anything about your world. Good. Keep it that way. My world is exhausting. They talked for 3 hours. Victor asked questions about her work, her art, her life in the coastal town. He listened like her answers actually mattered. He told her about his company. The resort platform he had started with nothing but an idea and a laptop and a stubborn refusal to accept that his father was right. The early failures that had almost broken him. The determination to build something that no one could take away. I did not have advantages, Margaret. No family money. No connections. Everything I have came from here. He touched his chest. And here. He touched his temple. The irony was almost painful. Margaret told herself she would reveal the truth later. After they were solid. After their connection was secure enough to survive the revelation. She told herself a lot of things that night. Victor did not disappear after that first dinner. He called the next day. And the day after. And every day for the following 2 weeks until Margaret stopped being surprised when his name appeared on her phone. He showed up at the Historical Society with coffee and questions about her current projects. He walked with her along the beach in the evenings, listening as she talked about the documents she was preserving, the families she was helping research, the small discoveries that made her work feel meaningful. He treated her apartment like a treasure rather than a limitation. I love that you do not need luxury. He said this one evening as they sat on her narrow couch eating takeout from paper containers. Everyone in my world is obsessed with appearances. Expensive restaurants with terrible food but impressive decor. Parties where everyone is performing instead of connecting. Relationships built on what we can do for each other instead of what we feel. That sounds exhausting. It is. He set down his chopsticks and turned to face her fully. But you are different. You are real. You are not trying to be anything other than yourself. And I find that incredibly attractive. Margaret felt the warning signals she should have been heeding. The too fast intensity. The constant attention. The way he seemed to be studying her, learning her, cataloguing everything she revealed. But she was lonely. And he was charming. And he seemed to love the simple life she had built. You do not even know me. Then let me learn. The months that followed were the most intense of Margaret's life. Victor pursued her with a passion that took her breath away. He attended the Historical Society's small fundraising event and donated generously without making a show of it. He sat for hours in her apartment watching her paint, asking questions about her process, treating her creativity like something sacred. He shared more of his past. The mother who had died when he was young. The father whose criticism had shaped him into either a success or a monster, depending on which day you asked. The early years of his company when he had worked 20-hour days and slept on an office couch and wondered if he was destroying himself for nothing. I needed to prove I was worth something. His voice was raw when he talked about those years. That I deserved to exist. That my father was wrong about me. Margaret understood that need. She had felt it herself, walking away from everything to discover if she was more than a name. But she never told him that. You are worth something. She said it with conviction because she believed it. She had seen him interact with waiters and hotel staff and the elderly volunteers at the Historical Society. He was not cruel. He was not dismissive. He saw people. Or at least he seemed to. "I am falling in love with you." Victor said this 4 months after they met, lying in her narrow bed, streetlight filtering through the thin curtains. Margaret's heart raced. "I am falling in love with you too. I want to marry you." The words hung in the air like a promise and a question and a door that led somewhere she could not clearly see. "Victor, we have only known each other 4 months. I do not care." He sat up, his eyes intense in the dim light. "I have never felt this way about anyone. I have never met someone who makes me want to be better, to build something real, to create a life that matters beyond profit margins and investor presentations." He took her hands in his. "Say yes, Margaret. Build a life with me." She should have told him then. She should have said, "Before you propose, there is something you need to know about who I really am." She should have trusted him with the truth. Instead she said yes, and told herself she would reveal everything later. After the wedding. After they were solid. After the love was strong enough to survive the revelation. She told herself so many things. They married at the county courthouse 6 weeks later. Margaret wore a simple dress from a vintage shop. Victor wore the one suit he owned that was not designed for boardrooms. No family on either side. No photographers. No guests except 2 strangers pulled from the hallway to serve as witnesses. "Do you, Margaret Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Do you, Victor Aldrich, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do. I now pronounce you husband and wife." Victor kissed her with an intensity that made the courthouse clerk look away. "I love you, Margaret Brennan Aldrich. I love you, Victor." And in that moment, surrounded by strangers in a government building, Margaret believed she had found what she had been searching for. Real love. Authentic connection. A man who loved her for her essence, not her inheritance. She had never been happier. Or more naive. The first year of marriage was everything Margaret had hoped for. They moved into a modest house outside town, combining their lives and their furniture and their dreams. Money was tight because Victor's company was growing but not yet profitable. So they budgeted carefully and cooked at home and found free entertainment in walks on the beach and evenings spent reading together. Margaret continued working at the Historical Society. Victor continued building his resort platform. They supported each other through setbacks and celebrated each other's victories. "I love coming home to you." Victor would wrap his arms around her after another 16-hour day at the office. "You are the only thing in my life that makes sense." Margaret believed him. She painted constantly during that first year, channeling her happiness onto canvas in colors that seemed to glow from within. Watercolors of their small life together. The kitchen where they made breakfast. The bedroom where they slept tangled in each other. The beach where they walked on Sunday mornings. Victor hung every piece on their walls. "My wife is a genius," he would tell anyone who visited. "A real artist. Not like the pretentious gallery types. She creates from the soul." Margaret would blush and deflect. But secretly she treasured every word. Here was a man who loved her for her essence. Here was proof that real love existed outside the golden cage of the Holloway name. There were quiet moments when she almost told him the truth. Watching him sleep, she would practice the words in her head. "There is something I need to tell you about my family. About who I really am." But he looked so peaceful. And the truth might shatter everything. She wrote a letter to her mother and finally sent it. "Dear Mother, I am married. His name is Victor. He does not know who I am. Who we are. He loves me for myself and I cannot risk losing that by revealing the truth. I know you will have opinions about this. I know William will be furious. But I am happy. For the first time in my life I am truly happy. Please do not try to find me. Please do not interfere. If I need you, I promise I will call. All my love. Margaret." Eleanor's response arrived 2 weeks later. A brief note in her mother's elegant handwriting. "My darling girl. If you are happy, then I am happy. I will wait. I will not interfere. But know that I am always here. That the door is always open. That nothing you could ever do would make you less my daughter. Be wise. Be careful. Be loved. And come home when you are ready. All my love. Mother. Margaret tucked the letters away in a place Victor never looked. The secret became a small locked room in her chest. She tried to forget it was there. The shift began so gradually that Margaret barely noticed it at first. It started with the investors. Victor's resort platform had finally attracted serious venture capital. Suddenly, their modest house was hosting dinner parties with men in suits worth more than their monthly mortgage. Women with jewelry that caught the light and made Margaret's simple pieces look like costume accessories. Margaret did her best to be a good hostess. She cooked. She smiled. She tried to participate in conversations about market valuations and user acquisition strategies. But she felt increasingly out of place. Like she was watching a performance she did not understand and had not been given the script for. The morning after one particularly awkward dinner party, Victor made his first request. Maybe do not mention the historical society so much. His tone was gentle, almost apologetic. The investors do not really relate to that kind of work. Margaret looked up from her coffee. What should I talk about? I do not know. Just try to fit in more. Talk about things they are interested in. It was such a small request. So reasonable on the surface. These were important dinners. She should make an effort. But it was the first time Victor had ever asked her to be something other than herself. The requests kept coming. Each one small and reasonable and slowly adding up to a larger message. Maybe wear something more polished tonight. Could you do something different with your hair? Something more professional. Perhaps do not talk so much about document preservation. It is a bit niche. Each adjustment was presented as being for her benefit. To help her feel confident. To make her more comfortable in these situations. But the underlying message was clear. The woman Victor had fallen in love with was no longer good enough. By the end of their second year of marriage, Victor's company had become a genuine success. The modest house became a waterfront estate with views of the harbor. The dinner parties became galas. The occasional investor meeting became a constant rotation of important people requiring constant entertainment. Victor hired an image consultant. Lillian Hayes arrived with a polished smile and a gentle condescension that made Margaret's skin crawl. We want to present you at your best, Mrs. Aldrich. Shopping trips were scheduled. Approved wardrobes were purchased. Coaching sessions were arranged to teach Margaret what to say and what to avoid. You are representing the Aldrich brand now. Victor explained when she protested. People are watching us. We need to present the right image. What is wrong with my image? Nothing is wrong. I just want to help you feel more confident. But Margaret did not feel more confident. She felt like she was disappearing. Her art supplies were moved to a back closet. Her paintings were taken down one by one, replaced by pieces selected by an interior designer. We want a cohesive aesthetic. The designer explained without looking at Margaret. Your watercolors are lovely, but they do not fit the vision. Margaret painted in secret now. Hiding canvases in a storage closet Victor never entered. The paintings grew darker. Greys and blues and the particular loneliness of being invisible in your own home. She was surrounded by luxury and had never been poorer. Mrs. Crane noticed the change. Margaret still visited the Historical Society occasionally, though Victor had been gently discouraging her from working. You used to light up when you walked through that door, Mrs. Crane observed one afternoon. Now you look like you are carrying stones. I am fine. That is exactly what people say when they are not fine. Mrs. Crane set down the document she had been cataloguing. That husband of yours has ambitious eyes. Be careful those eyes do not start looking past you. Margaret laughed off the warning. But she did not forget it. Victor began attending events without her. Important dinners where she would not fit in. Industry parties where her presence might be awkward. Charity galas where he needed to focus on networking rather than, and this was his exact word, babysitting his wife. You do not really enjoy these things anyway. He would say this while adjusting his tie in the mirror, not looking at her face. Would you not rather stay home and paint? She would rather have been by his side. But she had learned that expressing that preference led to arguments she could never win. The waterfront mansion felt larger every day. More echoing. More empty. Margaret wandered through rooms she had not chosen, past furniture she had not selected, surrounded by art that was not hers. She was a ghost in her own life. A decoration that had outlived its purpose. She considered calling her mother. The phone was in her hand one evening. Her mother's number glowing on the screen. One dial and everything would change. Eleanor would send cars, lawyers, the full protection of the Holloway name. But that would mean admitting the experiment had failed. That she had given up her identity to find real love and had found a man who loved a version of her that no longer existed. Pride stopped her. Shame stopped her. The slow erosion of her self-worth stopped her. She put down the phone and told herself she would call tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Diana Weston appeared in Victor's orbit during their 4th year of marriage. Daughter of hotel chain executives. Blonde. Polished. The kind of beauty that photographed well and made the right impressions at the right parties. She attended dinners that Margaret was excluded from. Her name appeared in Victor's calendar with increasing frequency. Business meetings. Strategy sessions. Partnership discussions. Margaret noticed the way Diana looked at Victor across crowded rooms. Proprietary. Patient. Waiting. She noticed the way Victor looked back. At a charity event Margaret was permitted to attend, she watched them standing together near the bar. They stood closer than colleagues. They shared private jokes. They touched casually in ways that meant nothing and everything. Margaret's stomach turned cold. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself Victor loved her. But she stopped believing herself. The text message appeared on Victor's phone 3 months before the gala. He had left it carelessly on the bathroom counter while he showered. It buzzed with an incoming message that appeared on the locked screen. Cannot wait for this farce to be over. Soon, my love. D. Margaret stared at the words until the screen went dark. Farce. D. Diana. When Victor emerged from the shower, steam following him into the bedroom, Margaret confronted him. Who is D? His face gave nothing away. What are you talking about? The text on your phone. Cannot wait for this farce to be over. Who sent that? You went through my phone. It was on the counter. The message appeared on the screen. Answer the question. Victor's expression shifted. Not guilt. Something harder. Annoyance. Diana is a business partner. Nothing more. The text says my love. Affectionate language. Some people communicate that way in business. Europeans especially. It does not mean anything. Margaret knew he was lying. She could see it in the slight tension around his jaw. The way he would not quite meet her eyes. Are you having an affair? Victor sighed with exaggerated patience. Natasha, I do not have time for paranoid accusations. I am building an empire. I am under enormous pressure. If you cannot trust me after 4 years of marriage, then perhaps we have bigger problems than text messages. He turned it around on her. Made her the problem. Made her jealousy and insecurity the issue rather than his behavior. By the end of the argument, Margaret was apologizing. She walked away more confused than when she started. But she knew what she saw. She tried one more time to reach him. A planned dinner, just the two of them, trying to reconnect. She suggested it hopefully. He agreed with obvious reluctance. At the restaurant his phone buzzed constantly. He checked it repeatedly, barely listening to her words. She reached across the table and took his hand. Victor the First, feel like I am losing you. Like I have lost myself. Can we please talk about what is happening to us? His response was measured and cold. What is happening is I am building an empire while you worry about feelings. I am worried about our marriage. Our marriage is fine. You are the one making problems where none exist. Am I? Because you barely speak to me. You barely look at me. You go to events without me. You come home at midnight smelling like perfume that is not mine. His eyes narrowed. What exactly are you accusing me of? I am asking you to be honest with me. I am being honest. You are being paranoid. He pulled his hand away and gestured for the check. I do not have time for this, Margaret. Be grateful for what you have. He paid the bill and left her sitting alone at the table. Margaret sat there for 20 minutes before she could make herself move. The weeks before the gala passed in a blur of quiet desperation. Margaret moved through the days like a sleepwalker. She knew something was coming. She could feel it in Victor's dismissive satisfaction, in the way Diana's name appeared on every calendar, in the knowing smiles of Victor's mother during their weekly dinners. The gala invitation arrived in an embossed envelope. Harbour Point grand opening. The resort Victor had been building for 5 years. His crowning achievement. He insisted Margaret attend. "I need you there. It is important." Strange given how often he excluded her. But she agreed. Because she did not know how to refuse. Because she still hoped, somehow, that she was wrong about everything. The night before the gala she stood at the window of their waterfront mansion, watching boats rock in the harbour, watching the distant lighthouse sweep its patient beam across the darkness. She thought about calling her mother. She thought about getting in her car and driving north until she reached the Holloway compound. She thought about a lot of things. But she did nothing. She went to bed alone because Victor was working late. She lay awake staring at the ceiling. And she waited for the morning to come. The gala began at 7. Margaret arrived in a dress someone else had selected. Hair styled by someone else. Jewelry chosen by someone else. She was a costume Victor was wearing to this event. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers salvaged from a 19th century sailing vessel. 200 guests in evening wear. Champagne flowing. Conversation buzzing with the energy of people who believed they mattered. Margaret circulated through the crowd, making appropriate small talk, performing the role of Victor's wife. But no one really saw her. They looked through her like she was transparent. Victor commanded attention. He greeted everyone by name. He worked the room with practiced ease. He barely acknowledged Margaret except to position her correctly for photographs. Diana was there. Emerald silk. Diamonds at her throat. Standing across the ballroom with a glass of champagne and a smile that said she had already won. Their eyes met once. Diana raised her glass slightly. A toast. A victory lap. Margaret understood then. She understood exactly what was about to happen. But she stayed. Because she did not know where else to go. Victor raised his glass at 9:15. The champagne caught the light. The room fell silent. 200 faces turned in his direction. Margaret's heart was loud in her ears. "Before we continue celebrating this magnificent property, I have a personal announcement." She watched his mouth form the words. She watched his expression. The careful construction of regret masking satisfaction. "My wife has been many things to me during our marriage. Patient. Accommodating. Simple in her tastes and her expectations. Simple." There it was again. The word he had used as both compliment and weapon. But as Harbour Point expands. As we prepare to become the premier destination on the eastern seaboard. I have come to realize that some partnerships have natural endpoints. Diana rose from her seat in emerald silk. The divorce papers appeared. "I am asking Margaret to sign them tonight. Here. In front of everyone who matters to our future. 200 people watching. 200 people who could have objected. The silence of complicity." Victor placed the leather folder in front of her. "Sign them. I will make sure you are comfortable. Enough to go back to whatever quiet life you had before I found you." Margaret looked at the papers. At the man she had loved. At the woman already claiming her place. At 7 years of her life dissolving in a single public moment. She thought of her mother's promise. "If you ever need me, I will move heaven and earth to reach you." She thought of the lighthouse on the point, sweeping darkness every 30 seconds. She thought of who she was before Victor. And who she had become. And who she might still be. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not give him the performance he was demanding. She picked up the pen. Signed her name. Margaret Brennan Aldrich. One final time. Stood without urgency. Walked through the silent crowd. Every step measured. Every breath controlled. The door opened. The night air touched her face. She walked into the darkness. And behind her, in the ballroom she would never enter again, Victor Aldrich accepted congratulations. Diana took her place at his side. 200 witnesses resumed their champagne and their conversations and their careful pretense that nothing shameful had just occurred. None of them knew. None of them could have possibly guessed that the woman Victor Aldrich had just publicly destroyed was worth more than every person in that room combined. And her family was about to make sure he never forgot it. Margaret sat on the bench by the harbour for 47 minutes. The tears had stopped. The shock had settled into something cold and clear. She watched the boats rock and the lighthouse sweep and the stars appear one by one in the darkness overhead. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her mother. She answered. "The car will be there in 3 minutes." Eleanor's voice was calm and steady. "William is with me. We are 2 hours behind." "Mother, You do not need to explain anything. We are coming. I should have called sooner. You are calling now. That is what matters." 3 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the waterfront. The driver emerged, a man Margaret did not recognize, and opened the rear door. "Mrs. Holloway." He said it naturally, like the name had always belonged to her. "Your family is waiting." Margaret climbed into the back seat. The leather was soft. The interior was warm. The car smelled faintly of her mother's perfume, as if Eleanor had been here recently, preparing for exactly this moment. The car pulled away from the harbour. Away from the resort Victor had built. Away from the life Margaret Brennan Aldrich had lived for 7 years. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the gala grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. Margaret watched them go. And for the first time since she walked out of that ballroom, she smiled. Not because she was happy, but because she knew something Victor did not. She knew exactly what he had just signed away. 48 hours later, Eleanor Holloway walked into the waterfront conference room where Victor Aldrich was meeting with his investors. She was accompanied by William, by 3 attorneys, and by a folder containing documents that had been waiting 7 years to be delivered. Victor looked up from his presentation. His smile faltered. His face went pale. "Mr. Aldrich." Eleanor's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it. "We have not been formally introduced." She set the folder on the conference table. "I am Eleanor Holloway, Margaret's mother." The conference room fell silent. Victor's investors shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The presentation slide still glowed on the screen behind him, showing projected revenue figures and expansion plans and a future that was already beginning to crumble. "Holloway." Victor repeated the name like he was tasting something bitter. "Holloway Maritime. You seem familiar with the name." Eleanor did not sit. She stood at the head of the conference table, silver hair immaculate, posture perfect, radiating the quiet authority of 6 generations of American commerce. William positioned himself near the door. Not blocking it. Simply present. His jaw was tight with controlled fury. "You own." Victor's voice faltered. "You own everything." Eleanor's smile was thin as a blade. "Every inch of waterfront your resort occupies. Every port your suppliers depend on. Every shipping route that keeps your construction materials arriving on schedule." She opened the folder she had placed on the table. "My daughter chose to live anonymously. She wanted to discover if love existed beyond the weight of inheritance. She found you instead." The investors exchanged glances. One of them, a silver-haired man who had been celebrating Victor's success just 48 hours earlier, quietly closed his laptop. Diana Weston sat frozen at the far end of the table. The emerald silk she had worn to the gala had been replaced by a charcoal business suit, but her expression was the same. Calculating. Already determining which way the wind was blowing. William stepped forward and began distributing documents to each person at the table. "The leases for your properties were signed with conditions." His voice carried none of his mother's calm. Only cold precision. "Conditions that include morality clauses and partnership requirements that you have now violated quite publicly." Victor reached for the papers in front of him. His hands were trembling. "You cannot do this. The permits for your expansion require waterfront access through Holloway Holdings." William continued as if Victor had not spoken. "The loans you secured were guaranteed against property values that depend on our cooperation. The suppliers you contracted move goods through ports we have controlled for 150 years. This is extortion. This is commerce, Mr. Aldrich." Eleanor's voice remained perfectly steady. Every contract has consequences for breach. You signed agreements with entities that trace their ownership back to my family. You built your empire on land you never truly owned. You expanded using infrastructure you never controlled. She picked up one of the documents and held it toward the light. Did you never wonder why the permits came through so quickly? Why the waterfront access was granted without the usual delays? Why every obstacle seemed to dissolve before you reached it? Victor's face drained of color. We cleared the path for you. Eleanor set the document down. My daughter asked us to. She believed in your vision. She wanted you to succeed. She thought that if she helped you quietly, without revealing who she was, you would see it as your own achievement. Your own proof that you mattered. She paused. She loved you that much. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Victor looked around the room. At his investors, who would not meet his eyes. At Diana, who was already gathering her things. At the attorneys who stood behind Eleanor like sentinels. Where is she? His voice cracked. Where is Margaret? Eleanor studied him for a long moment before answering. She is home. Where she belongs. Where she should have been years ago instead of waiting for you to see what was standing right in front of you. I want to talk to her. My daughter signed your divorce papers because she wanted nothing from you. Not your money. Not your name. Not even the satisfaction of watching you understand what you had lost. Eleanor's voice dropped to something almost gentle. But I am not my daughter. And I believe in consequences. She turned to the attorneys. Begin. The next 3 hours were a systematic dismantling of everything Victor Aldrich had built. Lease terminations were served. Effective immediately. The waterfront properties that housed his flagship resort would need to be vacated within 90 days. Permit review requests were filed. The expansion projects that represented his company's future were suspended pending investigation of irregularities that Holloway attorneys had documented. Loan covenant violations were reported to every financial institution that had extended credit to Victor's company. The collateral values were being reassessed. The terms were being reconsidered. Supplier contracts were examined. Every vendor who moved goods through Holloway-controlled ports received notification that their shipping arrangements were under review. Victor sat at the head of his conference table and watched his empire collapse. The investors left first. One by one, with apologetic murmurs and avoided eye contact. They had meetings to attend, calls to make, portfolios to protect. None of them looked back. Diana was next. She stood, smoothed her suit jacket, and walked toward the door without a word. Diana. She paused but did not turn around. We had plans. Victor's voice was desperate now, stripped of its usual confidence. We were building something together. We were building on your success. Her voice was flat. Practical. The voice of someone cutting losses. Your success is gone. You used me. Diana finally turned. Her expression held no guilt. No regret. Only the mild annoyance of someone whose time was being wasted. We used each other, Victor. Do not pretend otherwise. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. Victor sat alone in his conference room, surrounded by documents that spelled his ruin. The presentation slides still glowed on the screen behind him, projecting a future that no longer existed. He thought about Margaret. Her face in the ballroom when he had announced the divorce. Her dignity when she signed the papers. Her refusal to cry or plead or give him the satisfaction of visible devastation. He had not understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now. What Victor did not know, what he would not learn until much later, was that Margaret had chosen not to be present for his destruction. The conversation had happened the night before, at the Holloway compound. Margaret stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, looking out at the lighthouse that had guided ships home for 200 years. Eleanor sat in the chair by the fireplace. William paced near the door. Do you want to watch? Eleanor asked the question without judgment. Without expectation. Simply offering a choice. Margaret was silent for a long moment. No. William stopped pacing. You cannot be serious. He humiliated you in front of 200 people. And now 200 people will watch him fall. Margaret's voice was quiet but steady. That is enough. He deserves to see your face. to understand exactly who he destroyed. I know what he deserves. Margaret turned from the window to face her brother. But I also know what I deserve. And I do not deserve to become someone who takes pleasure in destruction. This is not destruction. Eleanor's voice was gentle. This is justice. Maybe. Margaret moved to sit across from her mother. But let it be your justice. Not mine. William shook his head. I do not understand you. I know you do not. Margaret smiled slightly. You were born for this world. For the negotiations and the leverage and the careful application of power. I was not. She looked down at her hands. The hands that had catalogued documents and painted watercolors and built a small quiet life that had meant something to her. I spent 7 years trying to become what Victor wanted. Smaller. Quieter. Less myself. She looked up at her mother. I will not spend another moment becoming what his destruction requires. Eleanor studied her daughter for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Then we will handle it. You focus on healing. Margaret nodded. That night, she slept in her childhood bed for the first time in 7 years. The lighthouse beams swept across her window every 30 seconds, appearing and disappearing in the familiar rhythm that had lulled her to sleep for the first 25 years of her life. She did not dream of Victor. She did not dream at all. The collapse of Victor Aldrich's empire took 18 months. It began with the permits. The review process that should have been routine became an investigation. Irregularities were discovered in the original applications. Environmental assessments were questioned. Community impact studies were revisited. The expansion projects that represented Victor's future were suspended. Then delayed. Then formally rejected. The waterfront properties followed. Without the permits for expansion, the resort's value plummeted. Without the resort's value, the loans became unsecured. Without secured loans, the banks called in their debts. Victor fought. He hired lawyers who were not connected to the Holloways. He attempted countersuits. He gave interviews to business publications about unfair persecution and old money tyranny. None of it mattered. Every door he tried to open led back to infrastructure the Holloway family controlled. Every relationship he tried to leverage revealed connections he had never noticed. Every alternative path he explored ended at a port or a shipping route or a piece of waterfront that required permissions he could no longer obtain. The Holloways did not need to destroy him directly. They simply withdrew their invisible support. And gravity did the rest. 6 months after the confrontation in the conference room, Victor sold the waterfront mansion. The sale covered a fraction of his debts. He moved into a rented apartment in a building that would have embarrassed him a year earlier. 3 bedrooms. Harbor view. Nice by ordinary standards. Ordinary. The word felt like a prison sentence. Diana Weston married into a European hotel chain 8 months after she walked out of Victor's conference room. The wedding was covered in the society pages. She looked radiant. She looked like she had never known anyone named Victor Aldrich. Victor read the announcement alone in his rented apartment. He had believed Diana loved him. Believed she saw something in him beyond his success. Believed their connection was real. He understood now that he had been a stepping stone. A means to an end. A useful alliance that became useless the moment his power evaporated. He wondered if that was how Margaret had felt. Invisible. Dispensable. Valuable only for what she represented rather than who she was. The thought kept him awake at night. 1 year after the confrontation, Victor wrote a letter. He had tried calling Margaret directly. The number was disconnected. He had tried reaching out through attorneys. His letters were returned unopened. He had tried contacting mutual acquaintances. None of them would speak to him. So he wrote a letter. He sat at the desk in his rented apartment, looking out at a harbor view that reminded him of everything he had lost. He wrote and rewrote the words until his hand ached. Margaret. I do not expect you to forgive me. I am not sure I deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that I understand now what I failed to understand then. You were the realest thing in my life. You saw me as a person when everyone else saw me as a potential prophet. You believed in me when I was still trying to believe in myself. I destroyed that. I convinced myself that your simplicity was limitation. That your gentleness was weakness. That your contentment with small things was lack of ambition. I was wrong about everything. The woman I called simple was the only person who ever loved me without condition. The life I dismissed as beneath me was the only authentic life I ever lived. I built an empire to prove I was worth something. And in building it I threw away the only thing that actually gave me worth. I am sorry. I know those words are inadequate. I know they cannot undo what I did to you in front of 200 people. I know they cannot give you back the years you spent diminishing yourself to fit my expectations. But I am sorry. If you ever want to talk, if you ever want to hear my voice say these words instead of reading them on paper, if you ever want to give me a chance to be the man I should have been from the beginning, I will be waiting. Victor. He addressed the envelope to the Holloway compound. He knew it would reach her. He did not know if she would read it. He mailed it anyway. 3 weeks later, the letter was returned. Unopened. Victor stood in his apartment holding the envelope. His own handwriting stared back at him. Return to sender. No explanation. No response. She had not even read his words. The rejection was absolute. Final. More devastating than anything he had experienced before. Not because she was angry with him, but because she had moved past anger entirely. He had become invisible to her. The same invisibility she had experienced for years in his presence. The irony was not lost on him. 18 months after the gala, Victor Aldrich's company formally declared bankruptcy. The announcement was a small item in the business pages. A brief note about a promising resort developer who had overextended. Market conditions were blamed. Timing was blamed. Everything except the truth. Victor did not contest the proceedings. There was nothing left to contest. The waterfront properties were sold to new developers. Developers with Holloway approval. The resort that had been Victor's crowning achievement would continue to exist under new ownership, new management, a new name. His name would not appear anywhere in its future. Diana's former associates avoided him at the few events he still attended. The investors who had once celebrated his vision pretended not to recognize his face. The society that had embraced his success forgot he had ever existed. Victor found a smaller apartment. 1 bedroom. No harbor view. He was not poor. He had been too practical to lose everything. But the empire was gone. The confidence was gone. The certainty that had defined him for 20 years had evaporated. He was 47 years old. He was alone. And he had no one to blame but himself. Sometimes, late at night, he would see Margaret's name in the news. Philanthropist establishes Maritime Preservation Foundation. Holloway family supports coastal conservation efforts. Anonymous donor funds historical society expansion. She had become someone without him. He could not say the same. While Victor's empire crumbled, Margaret was learning how to come home. The first weeks at the Holloway compound were strange. She walked through rooms she had known her entire life and felt like a visitor. The furniture was familiar, but the woman touching it was not. She had left as a girl searching for something. She had returned as a woman who had found something, though not what she expected. Eleanor gave her space. William gave her distance. The staff who had known her since childhood gave her privacy. She spent hours at the lighthouse, standing at the base of the tower, watching the beams sweep across the water, remembering all the nights she had fallen asleep to that rhythm, all the mornings she had woken to find the light still turning, still faithful, still guiding ships home regardless of whether anyone was watching. Some lights did not need acknowledgement to keep shining. She was beginning to understand that she could be one of them. 3 months after returning home, Margaret walked into her mother's study. Eleanor looked up from the documents she was reviewing. The same sharp eyes. The same elegant posture. The same unreadable expression that had intimidated business rivals for 4 decades. I want to do something. Eleanor set down her pen. What kind of something? Margaret sat in the chair across from her mother's desk. The same chair where she had sat 7 years earlier, asking permission to disappear. The historical society where I worked. It was small. Underfunded. Run by one woman who cared more about preservation than profit. Margaret paused. I want to build something like that. But bigger. A foundation that preserves maritime history along the entire coast. That trains young archivists. That protects harbors and documents and the stories of people who built this country with their hands. Eleanor studied her daughter for a long moment. That would require significant resources. I am aware. It would require your name. Your real name. You would have to stop being Margaret Brennan. I know. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I wondered when you would be ready. Ready. Ready to stop hiding. Ready to use what you have instead of running from it. Eleanor's voice was gentle. Ready to be a Holloway again. Margaret considered the words. I do not want to be a Holloway the way William is. The way you are. I do not want the boardrooms and the negotiations and the careful application of power. I know. I want to preserve things. Protect things. Build something that matters beyond balance sheets. I know that too. Can I do both? Margaret's voice was quiet. Can I be myself and carry the name? Eleanor reached across the desk and took her daughter's hand. My darling girl. That is all I have ever wanted for you. The Margaret Holloway Foundation for Maritime Preservation was established 6 months later. Margaret chose the name deliberately, not hiding behind initials or anonymous donations, claiming her identity for the first time since she walked away from it. The foundation acquired and preserved documents from historical societies along the eastern seaboard. It funded conservation efforts for aging lighthouses and historic harbors. It trained young archivists in the careful work of protecting fragile materials. Margaret taught classes during the summers. Children from dock worker families and fishing communities and the small towns that had grown up around harbors nobody famous had ever visited. She showed them how to handle old documents, how to read faded handwriting, how to find the stories of their own families in passenger lists and shipping manifests and census records. The work was quiet, meaningful in ways that could not be measured in profit margins. She painted constantly. Watercolors of the coastline, the lighthouse at different hours, the harbor in storm and stillness, the particular quality of light on water that she had missed for 7 years without knowing she was missing it. Her work was exhibited eventually, not because of her name but because it was good. Galleries contacted the foundation. Collectors expressed interest. Critics who had no idea she was a Holloway praised the emotional depth of her vision. Margaret declined most interviews. The work should speak for itself. She told the one journalist who managed to reach her. I do not need to explain what the paintings mean. That is for each viewer to discover. The journalist wrote about her anyway. Described her as reclusive, mysterious, an artist who had seemingly appeared from nowhere with a fully formed voice. Margaret smiled when she read the article. Appeared from nowhere. If only he knew. William visited the foundation office one afternoon, 3 years after Margaret's return. He stood in the doorway of her workspace, watching her catalogue a collection of 19th-century shipping logs that had been donated by a family in Connecticut. You seem happy. Margaret looked up. I am. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her desk. The same dynamic as their mother's study, reversed. I did not understand. William's voice was quieter than usual. When you left. When you refused to watch his destruction. I thought you were being weak. And now. Now I think you were being strong in ways I cannot comprehend. Margaret set down the document she had been examining. I was not being strong, William. I was being honest about who I am. She paused. I do not have your capacity for battle. I do not want it. What happened to Victor was necessary. But I could not be the one to deliver it without becoming something I did not want to be. William nodded slowly. Mother says you are twice the Holloway she ever was. Margaret laughed. Mother is exaggerating. Mother never exaggerates. She calculates. And her calculations include you. William leaned forward. She has been grooming you for something. I do not know what. But she sees something in you that she does not see in me. That is not true. It is true. And I am not jealous. William's expression was unreadable. I am built for the work I do. The acquisitions. The negotiations. The expansion of territory. That is my gift. What is my gift? William was silent for a moment. You make people feel seen. He said it simply, like a fact. You always have. When we were children, the staff adored you because you remembered their names and asked about their families. When you worked at that historical society, the old woman who ran it wept when she heard you were leaving. When you teach those children in the summer, they look at you like you have given them something precious. Margaret did not know what to say. Victor Aldrich was a fool. William stood and moved toward the door. He had the one person in the world who could have made his success mean something. And he threw her away for a woman who calculated his value in quarterly reports. He paused at the doorway. But his loss is our gain. Welcome home, Margaret. We missed you. The conference was held in Boston. 300 attendees from historical societies and preservation organizations across the country. Margaret was invited to deliver a keynote address on document recovery techniques. She stood at the podium and looked out at the faces in the audience. Archivists, historians, preservation specialists, people who cared about the same things she cared about. She spoke for 40 minutes about the importance of saving fragile materials, about the stories that lived in old papers and faded photographs and handwritten letters that no one had read in a century, about the connection between past and present that could only be maintained through careful stewardship. The applause when she finished was genuine. Afterward, during the reception, a man approached her. He was older than Victor, perhaps 55, grey at the temples, with kind eyes and a gentle bearing. He carried himself without the coiled tension of ambition, without the constant calculation she had learned to recognize in men who saw the world as something to be conquered. Your talk was remarkable. Thank you. I run a small maritime museum in Rhode Island. We have a collection of logbooks from whaling vessels that needs proper preservation. I have been struggling to find someone who understands the significance of what we have. Margaret smiled. Tell me about the collection. They talked for an hour. About logbooks and preservation techniques and the stories that lived in old documents. He asked questions without trying to impress her. He listened to her answers without calculating how they might benefit him. His name was Thomas Reeves. He had been a professor of maritime history before retiring to run the museum. He had been widowed 5 years earlier. He mentioned his late wife without awkwardness, with the gentle sadness of someone who had loved well and mourned honestly. I should let you get back to your other guests. He said it without presumption. But I wondered if you might be interested in seeing the collection sometime. Professionally speaking. Margaret studied his face. She had learned to read people in the years since Victor. To notice the small tells of manipulation and calculation. To recognize the difference between genuine interest and strategic positioning. She saw none of that in Thomas Reeves. She saw only a man who cared about old documents and wanted to share them with someone who understood. I would like that. He smiled. The expression transformed his face in a way that reminded her of nothing and no one from her past. Here is my card. Call whenever you are ready. No pressure. No expectations. He walked away without looking back. Margaret stood in the reception hall holding his card. She was not ready for romance. She might never be ready again. The wounds from Victor were healing, but the scars remained. But she was open to possibility in a way she had not been since walking out of that ballroom. That felt like progress. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the compound, as it had for 200 years. Margaret walked the cliff path on a spring evening, 5 years after returning home. The air smelled of salt and new growth. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in colors she had tried to capture on canvas 100 times without ever quite succeeding. She reached the lighthouse and leaned against its stone base. The beam would begin its sweep soon, as it did every evening at dusk. As it had since her great-great-grandfather built the tower in 1842. As it would continue to do long after she was gone. Some lights did not need to announce themselves. They simply kept shining. Steady and patient. Illuminating the darkness for anyone who needed guidance. Not demanding recognition. Not requiring acknowledgement. Just existing. Just being what they were meant to be. Margaret had learned to be that kind of light. She heard footsteps on the path behind her. Eleanor appeared, walking more slowly than she once had. 70 years old now. Silver hair perfectly arranged. Eyes still sharp despite the softening of age. I thought I might find you here. I come here most evenings. I know. Eleanor moved to stand beside her daughter. I used to watch you from the house. When you were small. You would sit at the base of this lighthouse for hours, staring at the water. I was watching the ships. You were imagining other lives. Eleanor's voice was gentle. Lives where you were not a holloway. Where you could choose your own path without the weight of expectation. Margaret smiled. Was I that obvious? You were always obvious to me. Eleanor turned to face her daughter. I knew you would leave eventually. I knew you needed to discover who you were without the name. I just prayed you would come back. Did you worry? During those 7 years. Every day. Every hour. Every time the phone rang, I was afraid it would be news that something had happened to you. Eleanor paused. But I also knew that you needed the freedom more than I needed the certainty. You let me go. I let you become yourself. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Do you regret it? Eleanor's voice was quiet. The 7 years. The marriage. Victor. Margaret considered the question. I regret the pain. She said finally. I regret trusting someone who did not deserve trust. I regret hiding who I was because I was afraid authenticity would be rejected. But I do not regret the search. I do not regret wanting to know if love existed beyond the name. I do not regret the years at the Historical Society, or the documents I preserved, or the paintings I created, or the life I built with my own hands. What did you find? In all those years. Margaret looked at the lighthouse. I found that I do not need someone else to see my worth in order for it to exist. I found that being diminished by someone who cannot recognize value says more about their blindness than my value. I found that the best response to being underestimated is simply becoming fully yourself. She turned to face her mother. I found that I am enough. Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears she would never admit to. You always were. She took her daughter's hand. From the moment you were born. You always were. The lighthouse beam began its sweep. Appearing and disappearing in the rhythm Margaret had known her entire life. Guiding ships home. Illuminating darkness. Patient and constant and faithful. 2 women stood at its base. 2 generations of strength expressed in different ways. Both finally understood. Victor Aldrich read about Margaret's foundation in a business magazine. He was 52 years old. Living in the small apartment that had become his permanent home. Working as a consultant for developers who did not know his history or did not care. The article described the foundation's work. The documents preserved. The lighthouses restored. The children taught to value history. It described Margaret Holloway as a visionary. A philanthropist. An artist whose watercolors captured something essential about the American coastline. It included a photograph. Margaret standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Silver threading through her dark hair now. Smile lines around her eyes. Looking directly at the camera with an expression of quiet confidence. She looked happy. She looked whole. Victor stared at the photograph for a long time. He had tried to contact her once more, 2 years after the first letter. A different approach. A shorter message. An acknowledgement that he had no right to ask anything from her but wanted her to know he had changed. That letter was returned too. He understood finally that there would be no reconciliation. No forgiveness. No second chance. He had been given something precious and had thrown it away because he was too blind to recognize its value. That was the consequence. Not the bankruptcy. Not the lost empire. Not the dissolution of everything he had built. The consequence was understanding what he had lost, and having to live with that understanding for the rest of his life. He set down the magazine. He walked to the window of his small apartment. He looked out at the city lights and thought about lighthouses, about patient beams sweeping darkness, about lights that kept shining whether anyone watched or not, about the woman who had loved him genuinely, completely, without condition, and about the man who had been too small to receive that love. He wondered if he could become bigger. He wondered if it was too late. He did not have answers. But he had time. And perhaps that would be enough. Margaret received one final letter from Victor. It arrived 10 years after the gala. 10 years after she had walked out of that ballroom with her dignity intact. 10 years after her family had dismantled his empire while she stood at the lighthouse watching the beams sweep across the water. The letter was brief. Margaret, I have spent 10 years trying to understand who I was when I stood in that ballroom and destroyed the only real thing I ever had. I was small, frightened, so desperate to prove my worth that I could not recognize worth when it stood right in front of me. I am not writing to ask forgiveness. I am not writing to ask for another chance. I am not writing to make myself feel better. I am writing because I owe you a debt I can never repay. The debt of acknowledgement. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was the worst thing that ever happened to you. I am sorry. Not for my empire collapsing. Not for the consequences your family delivered. I deserved all of that and more. I am sorry for the years you spent making yourself smaller. For the paintings you hid in closets. For the job you gave up. For the woman you stopped being because I could not see her value. You deserved better than me. I hope you found it. Victor. Margaret read the letter in her office at the foundation. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the harbor below. Ships moving in and out. The same rhythm of commerce and connection that had defined her family for 6 generations. She did not feel anger. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to peace. Victor had finally understood. 10 years too late to matter for their relationship. But perhaps not too late to matter for who he would become. She hoped he found whatever he was searching for. She hoped he learned to see value in unexpected places. She hoped he became someone worthy of the love he had thrown away. But those hopes were distant. Impersonal. The hopes you hold for strangers whose stories you will never know the ending of. He was part of her past. He was not part of her future. She filed the letter in a drawer she rarely opened. Then she returned to her work. There were documents to preserve. Lighthouses to restore. Children to teach. There was a life to live. The sun set over the Holloway compound on an evening in late autumn. Margaret stood at the lighthouse as she did most evenings, watching the beam begin its faithful sweep across the darkening water. She was 57 years old. Her hair was more silver than dark now. Her hands had the slight stiffness that came with age. Her eyes still held the same quiet intensity they had always held. She had built something real. The foundation had preserved over 2 million documents, restored 17 lighthouses, trained 300 young archivists, taught thousands of children that their history mattered. Her paintings hung in galleries she never visited. Critics praised her vision. Collectors valued her work. But the paintings she loved most were the ones that hung in her private rooms. The harbor at different hours. The lighthouse at dusk. The cliff path where she walked every evening. Simple subjects. Simple beauty. Simple truths. Thomas Reeves had become a friend. Perhaps something more, though they had never defined it. He visited often. They talked about documents and preservation and the stories that lived in old papers. They walked the cliff path together sometimes. They sat in comfortable silence without needing to fill it with words. He saw her clearly. He saw her gently. That was enough. William had married eventually. Had children who called Margaret aunt and demanded stories about ships and lighthouses and the old days before they were born. The Holloway name would continue. The empire would endure. Eleanor had passed 3 years earlier. Peacefully, in her sleep, with her children at her bedside. She had squeezed Margaret's hand at the end and whispered something that sounded like proud. Margaret had wept then. Had wept for days. But she had also felt grateful. Grateful for a mother who had understood her. Who had let her go so she could come back. Who had delivered justice while Margaret focused on healing. Who had loved her exactly as she was. The lighthouse beams swept across the water. Appearing and disappearing. Patient and constant and faithful. Margaret had learned that she was like that lighthouse. She did not need external validation to keep shining. She did not need recognition to know her worth. She did not need anyone to see her value in order for that value to exist. She simply was. And that was enough. Have you ever hidden who you were to discover if real love existed? Have you ever trusted someone who slowly taught you to trust yourself less? Have you ever signed away a marriage and walked into a darkness that turned out to be the path home? This was the story of a woman who gave up everything to find something real. She found betrayal instead. She found humiliation in front of 200 witnesses. She found divorce papers thrust at her by a man who called her simple and meant it as an insult. But she also found something else. She found dignity in the way she walked out of that ballroom. She found strength in the family she had walked away from. She found purpose in work that preserved the past for the future. She found herself. The man who tried to destroy her destroyed himself instead. Not through dramatic confrontation. Not through public revenge. Through the quiet consequence of losing the only person who had ever loved him without condition. He learned what she was worth by discovering what life looked like without her. That was the justice. Not what the Holloway family did to his empire. That was just commerce. The justice was the understanding. The years of living with that understanding. The knowledge that he had held something precious and thrown it away because he could not recognize value when it did not look like power. Margaret did not need to deliver that justice herself. She simply needed to become fully who she was. To keep shining. To keep creating. To keep preserving what mattered. The revenge, if you could call it that, was her happiness. The revenge was her wholeness. The revenge was the life she built without him. Some lights do not need to announce themselves. They simply keep shining, steady and patient, until those who are lost finally understand what they failed to see. Margaret Holloway was that kind of light. And in the end, that was enough.